And from our organization perspective at Jacobs, we've recently completed a survey where there was a really significant engagement from respondents. So we had a 50% response rate around the return to workplace and questions around the future of work. And there clearly is a desire, and a strong one at that, as a mandate to embrace the different ways that people have been working, and that the recognition of flexibility that's important. So clearly culture is going to be a major component of it. I think organizations that have a strong culture going into this have fared well. And I think that's why we've been able to see 90% of our organization work remotely and be successful in that. It's organizations that don't necessarily have a strong culture or a clear purpose that perhaps would struggle with that. So I think it's something where organizations are well positioned to benefit from, and recognizing in the future, back to that, there's not one size fits all for either the individual or for an organization, where you're going to have different levels of engagement and needs for. I think we all recognize the value of the in-person interaction. But if anything, I find now we're better connected, both globally and nationally, with our colleagues because of the situation we find ourselves in. There was only only so many planes you could be on, or so many places you could travel to. And certainly I'm not missing the experience of being in DFW or any other airport at the moment. So there's, I think there's been some really positive lessons out of that, as far as how you can foster culture and continue to embrace a strong culture in an organization.
Yeah, that's helpful. And Barry, how do you see it at Design Republic? I've been to your office. I've actually been to James's office as well a few times, but I've been into your place. You've got a strong culture there. How are you guys encouraging that while you're all working from home?
Yeah, as a smaller firm, we're about 50 people. Almost the entire team fits on a screen during a Zoom call, so you can connect with the entire firm. We have a weekly town hall meeting where we talk about work, but then there's also employee sponsored and organized happy hours and coffee breaks. And then there's personally reaching out to a number of people on a daily and weekly basis. So it's important to just keep in touch and to communicate. And I think but I think, one of my biggest concerns about the near term, the next 18 months, is as we're distanced and remote, how do we continue to maintain and build strong cultures? How do we foster community? How do we collaborate when we can only put 3 or 4 or 6 people in a room where we're used to having 16 or 20 people? So I think, it's going to evolve, but I think it's going to be very important that we all focus on keeping the culture strong, keeping the collaboration strong, keeping the connection strong.
I think we're certainly seeing that as a greater topic of conversation. I think the feeling is that there's a threat to culture right now. It could become either eroded or maybe slightly stale if we're not careful that we're putting in maybe an increased amount of effort to making sure the culture's right. And I think, Barry, we had an interesting conversation yesterday, didn't we? And one of the points you made was about employee onboarding and mentoring, and how some of those very, very vital elements that maybe wouldn't happen quite so simply or quite so effectively remotely. How can we foster that kind of activity in the workplaces that we're designing?
Yeah, I think we, with all the numbers and statistics and talk about markers on the floor and all that, we kind of lose track of the human element. And I think one of the biggest hurdles and challenges is going to be relieving and helping people overcome fear and anxiety and uncertainty. So I think as designers and furniture manufacturers and real estate providers, I think thinking about and intentionally designing spaces that are welcoming and calming and feel secure and safe and give a sense of belonging to people I don't know how that manifests itself, but I think, as I think about it, those are going to be important design factors, is to make people feel welcome and belonging and safe in an office. So it's hard to do that over a Zoom call.
We had a great comment from a panelist in one of the previous discussions we had, saying you go into the workplace for I think he called it your shot of culture and socialization, which I thought was a great way of describing it. And that probably needs to be as intense as it can be if we're less connected with the workplace. We're not going into the office every day in the future, even in the longer term. I think there's a comment in the Q&A, a question from Gabrielle saying, do you see organizations shedding space and real estate due to permanent work from home strategy? Well, there's probably a big topic there. We're glad of your views on that, Robyn. But I think for the long term, there's going to be a mixed, blended, distributed working model. Seems to be the theme that's emerging.
Because, I mean, we're at this point, for day one, when employees start to return to work, there'll be half of the seats available for employees to sit in. And then, over the next 6 months, we're looking at, our typical is a 5-foot bench. So it does not adhere to social distancing. So we're looking to do, a slight reconfigure of just kind of spacing them out a little bit. So there is 6 feet in between each desk and person when we can bring more people back. But for the next 18 months, kind of like Barry said, we don't see 100% of the staff being there because the spaces right now won't be able to accommodate them at a socially distant.
Robyn, do you guys think long term that there'll be a shift to more space or less space, or does the work from home and remote work offset the spreading people out?
Well, I think we at least need to allot for the 6-foot social distancing. We'll see what happens once a vaccine is available. I think once a vaccine is available, a lot of things will change. But we're hearing right now, until there's a vaccine, we would not have 100% employees back in the office at the same time.
Yeah, I think the message we've heard from most of the clients and people we're talking to is a very gradual and careful return.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that, like as far as the, if we're talking about post a vaccine era, I think that's when you can start to think differently about a portfolio. I think that, in the short term, about the value of bringing people back, like we were talking about previously, if you've got folks wearing face masks and having to be so distant, what starts, how valuable is that experience of being in physical place? We just talked about how, it's about community, social networking, mentoring. If you're doing all of that through a face mask and gloves and being sort of separate, what's the efficacy of that? Perhaps is something that organizations will need to grapple with and decide where they want to be on that. But I think post a vaccine or beyond this, that's when certainly I think organizations will be able to think differently about that portfolio, and those that want to continue to embrace and give their teams and their staff a greater flexibility. And as I mentioned, we've seen a great interest in that, both internally and certainly in engagement with some clients. So what does that mean then for a portfolio? And I think that for some, yes, there could be the opportunity to have a very different footprint that's markedly different to how it was prior to this. But I don't think this is all just in reaction to this. I think some of this was already in flight in the last few years. This is something that was gradually sort of happening. It was sort of like a death of, because there was a lot of people focused on utilization around the office in itself. But perhaps this is an accelerator to that change, and it starts to provoke and enable us to ask some different questions.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had a panelist on last week that was chatting about how the next 18 to 24 months can become your best place to experiment in the workplace and, change things up. you have a quarter of your staff there. You can actually make the changes while most of the team is at home. One question that has just come in that I thought was interesting is, if we were looking at a vaccination, at what point do we feel that a space, what becomes normal? When do we all of a sudden say, okay, everybody back to work? Or do we, you get Twitter who says that their employees can work from home indefinitely. Barry, have you seen any of your clients talking large cultural shifts like that, or still very measured response?
Gordon, I think, and it kind of goes back to what one of the things James was saying. I think there's three trends which were emerging. One was the work from home and agile workplace. The other was sort of just a sense of the need to de-densify. And then the third is the well-building and health and wellness in the workplace. I think all three of those things have rapidly accelerated, and we're going to see much more focus on all of those. I think from everything we hear, work from home is here to stay. CEOs and leaders who were resistant to it have just had to deal with it and have seen its efficacy, I think. Again, I don't know that that's going to lead to long-term reductions in the amount of space people take, but it's certainly going to change the way we occupy space. So I think agility, mobility, work from home are all going to stay, and we'll see, much different kind of office space as a result of that.
Is that what you're seeing, Robyn? Sorry, going out.
So I was going to pick up on one of the questions in the Q&A box, but if you wanted to share some thoughts on that point before we move on, go for it.
No, I'm just wondering if Robyn, what her thoughts were around that, around workplace strategy. Is obviously, a large organization. You have your 3-year plan, your 5-year plan, and I feel like most of our plans have just gone out the window. At least their 2021 has. How do you reconcile that? And what are some of the things that you're looking at to say, okay, we're starting to return to an area of normalcy, but as Barry has noted, we're gonna, bring forward, expedite these strategies that had been in place?
Well, overall, JP Morgan Chase was not a very work from home friendly organization. Everyone was in the office typically 5 days a week. On an occasion, you may work remotely. But I think that's going to be a major change. Like Barry said, work from home is here to stay, not on a full-time basis, but I was on a call yesterday, and when we do start to return to work, everybody will still be working from home a couple days a week, whether it's 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And, there'll be a schedule, and that's, to eliminate the travel, into different cities, as well as the management of people coming into the different buildings and elevator queues. In New York City, you're going to be temperature scanned to come into the building. Then you have to wait in an elevator queue. So all of this is going to add to time into your day when you were working from home quite efficiently. And, that's take you a half hour to get up in an elevator on a typical morning, and possibly staggering start times. So it's definitely going to be a change, and I think we're still working through that, what it's going to be, but we know for the immediate next, 12 to 18 months that we're going to be a little bit in flux, and, working from home, working from the office. I think people will be, just excited to get back to the office and collaborate with their peers and mentors and mentees. But not everyone's going to be there at the same time. So then how do you determine who comes in on what day? And, is it based on what project you're working on and what groups you need to meet with? So it's going to be challenging, but we'll definitely work through it and make it work.
If anyone's only just joined us, we're having a panel discussion around the post-COVID workplace with Space Store. Very delighted to be joined by our panelists today, James Kerrigan from Jacobs and Barry Ludlow from Design Republic and Robyn Romano from JP Morgan. There's just a couple of questions here which I'd like to kind of link together around the whole topic of recruitment, finding talent, retaining talent. There's a question there around the proving of the remote working or distributed working concept. Will that lead to more offshore teams? Is that going to lead to a global talent pool that isn't necessarily tethered to any particular geographical location? There was that concept, and then there's also a question from Chris asking around how the workplace has been so important in recruiting and retaining talent, with the workplace maybe being less of a factor. How's that going to impact on that as an organisation? What's JP Morgan been doing around the area of attracting and recruiting talent, and has that changed in the last 10 weeks? I think you're just muted there, Robyn.
I really can't speak to that because I know a lot of recruiting efforts have kind of been put on hold right now, especially our group is really working on COVID response, whether it's, the first tier of returning to work, second tier of projects inflate, and the third term, which is the future. So I can't really speak to that.
Be interested to hear whether James or Barry have any insights relating to the whole angle of attracting and recruiting talent.
I mean, I think the first part of the question that was sort of posing that notion of, is there I don't necessarily think it's just purely offshoring. I think we were already moving towards, as an organization, what you're ideally looking to do is bring the expertise to bear on a particular problem to provide a solution. And so we were always looking to bring the right expertise wherever the location was. And the challenge out in the past was perhaps that there would be some more of an expectation or a concern that if somebody was out of a particular location relative to where a client or a project might be, there might be, some clients might give that some pause, but even that in the last couple of years, I think had receded. So in this future state, I think this idea is going to be more accepted. I think it offers up greater opportunities to think differently. I think the idea that you have to be in a top tier expensive market, the challenges of hiring in somewhere like New York or San Francisco, and the fact that you've got designers coming into the industry that can't afford to live in those marketplaces, it gives you a different opportunity to think about. You look for where the talent is and where they want to be based, rather than the starting point of, now we have an office in X location and now we're only going to hire within that location. And so clearly it's not suddenly that everything's going to drive to being offshore. I think there's always going to be a place for that, but it's going to be about where the best expertise is and what the opportunity to hire the best and the brightest is. So I think that's one part to it. And then clearly there's other thoughts about the physicality and the value of that in terms of hiring, but I'll pause there for a second.
I think just joining James, I think I was just on a call earlier this morning with people in, I think, 10 different cities working on a project together. And, I don't know 12 weeks ago if I would have had that experience. So I think just the becoming so comfortable and used to this technology and other digital technologies to collaborate virtually, I think has removed a lot of hurdles to working. And whether it's within our own firm, this was with many different people. So I think that's one factor. And then I think another thing is, I think we've all seen in this isolation and working from home, a lot more flexibility in our schedules and maybe greater work-life balance. For some people that's working, for some it isn't. But I think the idea of flexibility, flexible hours, and the ability to work remotely is going to be something that's going to be important to our employees, to our colleagues, to recruits. So I think continuing to be able to offer flexibility and work-life balance, and I think maybe leaders because all of us are working from home, leaders may be more appreciative of those needs and concerns.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were getting a question from Mary Beth about that, about staggering the work hours. Would you stagger from a 9 to 5 workday with a shift towards different times? And then also one interesting one that I heard recently, I was speaking to a friend, and she was saying that a particular group she's working on is 25% of their staff's going to come back. All their 100% staff's going to come back, but they're going to come back in 25% increments, but they're going to stay together. So, and there, I think there was a question in there, you know, about creating small teams that are your work family where you can relax the social distance. And the thought concept behind that was if any one of them did contact COVID, you know, in 2 months, that entire group could be isolated from the other section of the staff. Because I think that's going to be a challenge, you know, until we get a vaccination. You know, there is going to be need to look at it. How do you contain this if it does pop back up? What would you say to that, Robyn? How are you guys looking at, you know, should something come back up in, let's call it 3 months' time? What is a strategy around that for your workplace?
Well, that's a concern with having people come back, you know, staggered, because initially, in the middle of March, when this first came about, we were going to implement an A team, B team, and the A team would be in the office for a week, the B team would be home, and then they would swap after the week. And, you know, when a lot of us left work on Friday, March 13th, that was the plan. And by Sunday, it was determined that everybody would be working from home. And I've talked to a few other people, and there's different things going on. I heard one company, they're moving forward with 3 teams, an A team, a B team, and a C team. And the A team would be in for a week, and then they'd be home for 2 weeks. So the thought is, if anyone in that group became ill, at least you're all home for 2 weeks and quarantined. I don't know how we're going to handle it, because we're being told that you'd be back a couple days a week, and there would be a specific team. So if you were on team 1, you may be in, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday on week 1, and on the next week you might be in Tuesday and Thursday. So, you know, I know we're doing intensive cleaning every night, but there's still going to be concerns, because how do you track it? Like who you've been in contact with in the office, on your way to the office, on your way home.
Yeah, that's a valid point that we're seeing.
Some great questions coming into the Q&A, so I'm going to try and wrap up those. We've got about 20 minutes left. There's a question, and I think a few related to it, which I'd be interested, James, in your views on. How much is the organisation responsible to keep people socially distanced? Or is it more to provide a clean space where the employers feel that all the precautions have been met? And then another question earlier on we had, or a comment earlier on, if I have to be dancing around dots and one-way systems and on constant high alert, then I prefer to work from home.
Right.
Which I can empathise with.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, and anything I'm talking about is not, you know, critiquing or suggesting that anyone else's thoughts around it. As far as what an organization's doing, it is, you know, wrong. Everyone's got, there are some organizations that there's a real need for a physical footprint and presence in an office. But I do think that this broader issue around what's to be gained by and what are the risk reward around it. And certainly in our own research, I think we're seeing that there is, just because a location sort of says, okay, now it's open, you can bring people back to a place. I think there are broader questions about what's the right timing to that, and what's the value. And I think certainly the issue around liability and the recriminations about who did what and how it happened. I think there's some really big issues beyond putting dots on floors about how you could take down a team. if you're not careful about when you bring people back to physical place. And I know one of the things that some colleagues of mine at Jacobs are looking at are, the statistical modeling and data around trying to mitigate risk. And so there's obviously physical prevention you can take, but then there's also using data and analysis to start to look at, how you can mitigate, and then what happens if you get an outbreak, how you can isolate people and then still continue on. But that is a tricky minefield and I think I heard it best put recently by a client who, suggested for some organizations there's, what's the return on investment in waiting and sort of pausing to see how this plays out? Because going back to what we talked about, if you're dealing with, if you can't really be together anyway in a place and you're missing half of your team and the room that you're in's got sort of 3 chairs in it, how rewarding is that as a physical workplace? If we're talking short term, not sort of a longer term, what is the value to that versus continuing to maintain a virtual environment? And then you really question what are the needs to bring people back to be present and physical, and what are those benefits? So yeah, there's no one answer. If I knew that, I would probably have a crystal ball in front of me.
I think managing the back to office experience is going to be a key thing that we all have to focus on. I think, in major metropolitan markets where people are relying on mass transportation, that's the first hurdle, getting people to their office space. Second hurdle is getting them up in elevators. There's a article this morning I saw about elevators and saying something like, to load 2,000 people into a mid-size office building based on 4 people in an elevator is going to take 56 minutes. Well, I know I might wait 5 minutes, but I'm not waiting 56 minutes to get on an elevator. So, and then once you get in the office, you've got, markers and red dots and safety, police tape and clean. So I think really that whole experience, just like the person who wrote the question for us, I'd rather work from home. So I think, yes, we have to make it all safe and secure, but managing that experience is going to be so important, that people continuing to provide engaging, exciting places that people want to be. I think a big part of that's going to be communication and change management and engagement, and getting people to understand what the new protocols are going to be, what are the new ways of working, at least for the next 18 months. But that experience is just going to be so important.
Yeah, that's good. We got a question from Scott Brown in regards to, is there any insights about replacing benefits that staff have, such as the tangibles at the workplace, the amenities, the food and beverage, with other options? That is a challenge. We were talking about this morning, weren't we, Alex, about, we all have our swag from work. We have our own keyboards. We have our own mouses. How do we, keep that up? I think it probably links back to the culture of a company. But let's talk about amenity spaces for a minute. How do you see those playing out, Barry, in the workplace?
Again, I think that's a big question about how amenities, how food service, how coffee service works in an environment. A lot of the state guidelines, I know New York state guidelines right now encourage people to bring lunch from home. How do you, maybe it's part of a protocol of, waiting at a safe distance to get to the coffee machine, wiping down the coffee machine between each use. It's a big question. And I think, maybe temporarily the organizations and enterprises that have the resources can potentially put in service models where there's service staff to do that as opposed to self-serve, and, pre-prepared box lunches, things like that. But, we've all businesses and design firms have spent so much time and money creating these amazing amenity spaces to bring people together, and how I'm curious likewise how we continue to provide those. I think we will provide them, but in the near term, next 16, 18 months, I think the use case is going to be very different.
If I'm a worker returning to the office in the next 2 or 3 months, the first day I walk into the office, what do you think are what are the things I'm going to notice that will be different to the office I walked away from?
De-densification. I mean, I think less people, right? I think there's going to have to be the signs and the guidance to instruct people and on the protocols. But hopefully there's a person there welcoming them and giving them some guidance on how to act in the office. I think change management is just going to be, and connection, providing touch points for employees is going to be so important.
And I think some organizations are possibly going to be looking to apply some of the learning that they're finding this situation, so that perhaps, in return to physical workplace, it's not necessarily that all organizations will be looking to go back to whatever that current state looked like prior to this. I think there is going to be that looking to learn and apply some of the behaviors from this, so that even with the lack of density that many organizations are going to be starting with, it's going to be perhaps looking at different ways of working, so that it's not just about going back in to try and have an office be all things to all people. It might be that there's a greater focus on even though it's somewhat counterintuitive, it's this partial communal version with face masks and all the rest of it, if that's the immediacy of, if we're talking that timeline, a lot of individual work is likely to continue to happen elsewhere. Solving for that individual work and what that experience looks like is something equally I think we need to take on. What are organizations going to do from an HR perspective? There's the implications of ergonomics around like not working in the office. What does that look like for people? And not everybody has the luxury of a spare bedroom or a situation that allows them to work comfortably from home. So what does that look like? So there's a whole bunch to work through there. But then in terms of the physical place, perhaps it's a test around this idea of the group communal social mentoring, but it's not just to bring people back to sit at desks. And in doing so, also that benefits the folks that have been through this from a work perspective, because then you aren't necessarily dealing with the queuing for the elevator and the concern about what you're touching and the whole journey of how you get from wherever you're working to your physical workplace.
Yeah, interesting. We had a good question from Edwin in regards to, do you see any clients consider providing products for their new long-term home workers or stipends? Interesting, I saw that Google is offering $1,000 to their employees. Any conversations, James? I remember about 6-8 weeks ago, you and I had this conversation. What are you seeing? What do you think around that?
Yeah, I think it's very much an active. There is no answer to it yet, but it's clearly top of mind within our organization and for many clients that we're talking to. Is what is that right level of support and balance, and is that as much you reference Google and their provision. Those types of things are very much what are being considered and talked about, because there needs to be an acknowledgement that if you're asking people to sort of normalize or make this a more permanent solution, then the issues around ergonomics and experience outside of a workplace are going to be equally important. And so you don't want to have the sort of be successful in potentially reinventing office and physical place for many organizations, and then find that the unintended consequences of people having problems with backs and necks. And normally in the background behind me, my sit to stand at the moment is a milk crate, that I stick, So I have to embrace these things as well. I sort of have to walk the walk. But I do think that coming up with those solutions of whether it's financial support, including there might be a lot of furniture going spare in the short term in a lot of organizations that rethink this. So how do you redeploy that? You don't have to necessarily start again from scratch, from new. There's a lot of barely used product that's pretty out for organizations that could be redeployed and used meaningfully. Because I know, like, when all this kicked off, a lot of our teams were able to go in and get some of the equipment out of the office. But how do you make that as a sort of more permanent state so that you're not sort of duplicating it, that you've got endless duplication of monitors and screens in physical work as well as in people's work at their homes as well?
Yeah, interesting. Robyn, do you see any conversations at JP Morgan about this?
Currently, we're not having any conversations. And considering we have 250,000 employees, we've gotten very few inquiries. We've had, some employees reach out to us, to see if they could get one of our typical chairs at our cost. So we're working on an as requested basis with, individual employees. But so far it's been kind of, quiet. Not many requests have come through. I know our accommodations team, they're still fulfilling accessibility accommodations for users at home as required. So those are still being met. But for a long term, we haven't really looked into that yet. It's something we're probably going to have to look at.
Yeah,
interesting question came in on that topic, saying that people have kind of accepted that the current situation of working from home is temporary and will kind of get by. But if this becomes a longer term phenomenon that's the norm, maybe organisations will have to consider providing some kind of ergonomic or workstation type environment. But then, Robyn, we were discussing yesterday, weren't we? What about the people who don't have that space available and maybe within walking distance of one of the main head office locations?
Yeah, so we have employees that they would rather be in the office just because they don't have, a space within their home or apartment to work, or they have small children. So we respect that, and those will be some of the first people that may go back to work. There's a lot of people that have a space. They are working very efficiently. I mentioned to the team yesterday, I have calls with Europe, Asia, so actually working from home has been kind of easier for me. It's not an issue to have a 7 a.m. call and then an 8:30 p.m. call the same day, because I'm home, I can stop, have dinner, do what I need to do, and still maintain my weekly calls with our international partners.
Good. Well, we've had some great thoughts and conversations, and appreciate everyone who's joined us today. I think we're just drawing to the end of our time. So again, thanks very much to the panelists for joining us. Thanks to James Kerrigan and Barry Ludlow and Robyn Romano. And thanks also to all the audience who joined and some fantastic questions. I've just seen a great thought from Joanna Lupus in London asking about what about more open air meetings. So maybe that's a thought for some. Not everyone has that space available as well, but that's an opportunity. So just to wrap up, we've got a further panel discussion on the 11th of June, the 11th of the month, which we'd love you to join and participate and listen in to some of the conversations we have happening then. Otherwise, we'd like to thank you all for joining us. Trust you have a fantastic rest of your day and stay safe. Thanks again and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you all.
I know.